Hi, so today we're going to talk about policy analysis. Specifically, I'd like to start with an example using texting and driving policy. So, uh, there was a story that a woman crashes into a driver and kills the driver and passenger. The parents of the victims sue Apple, the Apple Corporation, for choosing not to develop technology that would have prevented texting and driving, uh, because this technology is available. So, even though the vast majority of states have texting laws, uh, those laws don't seem to be altering behavior much. So, some argue that it should be put on the companies to make it so that your cell phone can recognize when you're in a car and disable the use of your cell phone. And others argue that public policy should be regulating texting and driving, like the laws we have now. In many states, and the education campaigns. And one of the things that uh, policy analysis can help us decide is, can policy solve this problem? And if laws are not helping, anti-texting and driving laws, then would a public education campaign be preferable, kind of like the anti-smoking campaigns that helped cut down the use of cigarettes. And so, you know, this is just one example of an area where we've identified a policy problem, and we can try to figure out what kind of policy solutions could be used to then mitigate the problem. So, what is the nature of policy analysis? Well, policy analysis usually involves collecting and interpreting information that clarifies the causes and effects of policy problems, public problems, and likely the consequences of using one policy option or another to address them. Policy analysis doesn't determine policy decisions, but it informs the process of public deliberation and debate. So, politics still plays a pivotal role in uh, forming public policy, but policy analysis can be used to inform the debate and help advocates make arguments for certain policies that would possibly solve the problem. Politics does sometimes prevail over policy analysis. For example, there's plenty of research that shows that term limits in state legislatures uh, have no positive governing effects uh, in comparison to states without term limits. As a matter of fact, term limits in your state legislatures may actually cause lobbyists to be more powerful and uh, hurt the ability of your elected representatives to govern. Nonetheless, we see a lot of politicians in recent years advocating for term limits because it's a politically popular stance to take. So let's talk about the policy analysis process. Now, in Smith and Larimer, in the textbook, we talk about different approaches: the positivist approach and the positivist approach to policy analysis. Uh, this process is mostly describing what we do with the positivist approach to policy analysis. So first we have to define and analyze the problem. What is the problem being faced? Where does it exist? Who does it affect? Uh, in this case, when we use the example from texting and driving, you might ask how does talking on a cell phone and texting compare to other distractions when you're in the car? Drinking coffee, using your GPS. is distracted driving the problem in general, or is texting specifically the problem? We need to know what the problem is in order to solve it. Uh, uh, a lot of times in politics and in policy analysis, we don't agree on what the problem is. What's the problem with the American education system? If we agree that we could be doing a better job of educating our children, is the problem that we have underfunded schools? Is the problem that we have unqualified teachers? Is the problem that we are lacking after-school programs? What's the problem? And then that's going to help decide what the solution is, if we can figure out what the problem is. So we need to define the problem to provide clarity. For example, if we have high unemployment, we need to decide, well, who is unemployed? Who gets counted as unemployed? And is bringing down unemployment always good? Should we really be focused on the underemployed, or should we be focused on raising wages, stagnant wages? You can see from the figure on the screen that real gross domestic product has been increasing, but the median household income has been stagnant. How do we define what that problem is? What are these issues? Then we need to construct policy alternatives. This is where we ask ourselves what policy options might be considered for dealing with the problem. When it comes to the texting and driving example, do we educate drivers on the dangers, or do we have cell phones automatically disabling cars? Do we pass legislation and implement policy that penalizes the people who use their cell phone in the car and are caught, or do we regulate industry to make it so that cell phone companies are required to have features on the phone that disable texting while you're traveling in an automobile? So we have these different options, and this step includes choosing from policy typologies. Do we want to regulate? Do we want to subsidize? Are we taxing and spending? Are we creating a market incentive? Are we creating a public education campaign and spreading information? What are we doing policy alternative-wise? What are the alternative policies the different types of policies that we're going to use? We also need to choose an evaluative criteria. So what criteria are appropriate for the problem and the alternatives? What is the cost of that alternative? What is the likely effectiveness of these alternatives? So we need to worry about what is effective versus what is ethical. If the goal is to save public dollars by limiting the number of people on welfare, one effective way to do that is to just end welfare programs. But is that ethical? Because then you're cutting people off from resources they need. So you need to be thinking from a standpoint of what are you doing to solve the policy problem? Is it effective and ethical? We need to decide what criteria are important. Are we looking at the cost effectiveness of a program? Or are we looking at the environmental impact? Those things would be different evaluative criteria. When looking at whether we should drill for more oil, if you look from a cost-effective standpoint, perhaps it's a good deal. If you're looking at it from an environmental criteria, then maybe it's not. Feasibility. Whatever the alternative is has to be feasible, politically feasible, and able to be implemented. And at what cost to values such as personal freedom. So we need to choose how we're evaluating what success is. What makes a good teacher? What makes student progress? How do we measure a healthy economy? How do we measure these things, and how do we evaluate what the policy problem is and how we can solve it. And then, of course, you need to assess alternatives. Which alternatives are better than others? Is a public education campaign better than regulating the cell phone industry? Are both good options? We need to decide which alternatives are better than others and what is the evidence available for each alternative. This is where a lot of policy briefs come in, where you define the problem, you evaluate the alternatives, and decide which alternatives are best for solving the problem. You can, as an example of this, you can collect evidence from different states to see what efforts are successful and unsuccessful when it comes to cell phone use while driving. When you're assessing alternatives, different states have different policies. Which ones are more effective? That's one of the things policy analysts do. And finally, you have to draw conclusions. You have to decide which alternative is most desirable and advocate for that alternative. And in a lot of these studies, still, even again, because we're talking about the implementation of policy and something that the bureaucracy does by enforcing policy, but at the same time, we need to think about politics too. So the best studies and the best policy alternatives also are sensitive to political realities. Sometimes the best solution isn't necessarily a feasible one. So those are the steps, the basic steps in policy analysis: define and analyze the problem, construct policy alternatives, choose evaluative criteria, assess the alternatives, and draw your conclusions. Thank you.